Namaste everyone, thanks for tuning in. Let's play today's game. I move my pawn at e3, opponent's pawn at e6, my pawn at d3, opponent's knight at d6, my pawn at c3, opponent's pawn at d6, my knight at f3, opponent's knight at d7. I move my bishop at e2, opponent moves at its bishop at e7. I move my knight at d2, opponent moves its king at f8. I move my bishop at f3, opponent moves its pawn at e5. I move my queen at b3, opponent moves its queen at e8. I move my bishop at b7, opponent moves its rook at b8. I move my queen at a4, opponent moves its knight at c5. I captures opponent queen at e8. Opponent king captures my queen at e8. I captures opponent bishop at c8. Opponent captures my bishop at c8. I castle. Opponent captures my pawn at d3. I move my knight at f3. Opponent captures my bishop at c1. I captures opponent's knight at c1. Opponent moves its pawn at c5. I move my knight at d2. Opponent moves its knight at d4. I move my pawn at c4. Opponent moves its pawn at c6. I move my pawn at b3. Opponent moves its pawn at a6. I move my knight at e4. Opponent moves its pawn at s5. I move my knight at s4. Opponent moves its pawn at g5. I move my knight at g6, threatening its rook and bishop. Opponent moves its rook at h6. I captures opponent bishop at e7. Opponent captures my bishop at e7. I move my knight at c3, targeting d5. Opponent moves its king at f6. I move my knight at d5, blocking black's pawns. Opponent moves its pawn at s4. I move my pawn at h3. Opponent takes my pawn with its knight at f2. My king captures opponent's knight at f2. Opponent moves its pawn at a5. I move my pawn at a3. Opponent moves its rook at b8. I move my rook at b1. Opponent moves its rook at h8. I move my pawn at b4. Opponent captures my pawn at b4. I captures opponent's pawn at b4. Opponent captures my pawn at b4. I captures opponent's pawn at b4. Opponent moves its rook at h8. I move my knight at b6. Opponent captures my rook at b1. I captures opponent's rook at b1. Opponent captures my pawn at c4. I move my rook at e1. Opponent moves its pawn at e4. I move my knight at b8. Opponent moves its rook at c4. I move my queen at g1. Opponent moves its pawn at f5. I move my knight at a6. Opponent moves its pawn at d5. I move my knight at b4. Opponent moves its rook at c4. I move my rook at b1. Opponent moves its king at e5. I move my knight at a2. Opponent moves its pawn at d4. I captures opponent's pawn at d4 with check. Opponent rook captures my pawn at d4. I move my rook at e1. Opponent king moves at f1. I move my king at f2. Opponent moves its rook at d2, threatening my knight. I move my rook at e2. Opponent captures my rook at e2. I captures opponent rook at e2. Opponent moves its pawn at e3. I move my knight at c3. Opponent moves its king at d3. I move my king at f1. Opponent moves its pawn at f4. I move my knight at e2 with check. Opponent moves its king at h2. I move my knight at g1. Opponent moves its king at g3. I move my knight at f3. Opponent moves its pawn at e2. I move my king at g1. Opponent moves its pawn at g4. I captures opponent pawn at g4. Opponent king captures my pawn at g4. I move my king at f2, blocking opponent's king. Opponent moves its pawn at e1, converting into bishop. My knight captures opponent's pawn at e1. Opponent moves its pawn at f3. I captures opponent's pawn at f3. I move my opponent moves its king at f4. I move my king at g2. Opponent moves its king at g5. I move my king at s3. Opponent moves its king at s5. I move my knight at d3. Opponent moves its king at g5. I move my pawn at f5 with check on king. Opponent moves its king at s5. I move my knight at f2. Opponent moves its king at g6, and this one is biggest mistake. I captures opponent pawn at s4. Opponent moves its pawn at h5, threatening my pawn. I move my king at g3. Opponent moves its king at f6. I move my king at g4. Opponent moves its king at g7. I move my king at g5. Opponent moves its king at g8. I move my king at h6. Opponent moves its king at h8. I move my pawn at f5. Opponent king's g8. I move my bishop at g4. Opponent moves its king at f7. I move my pawn at f6. Opponent moves its king at e6, and this one is his biggest mistake, I think. I move my king at g7. Opponent moves its king at f5. I move my knight at h6. Opponent moves king at e6. I move my pawn at f7. Opponent moves its king at e7. I convert my pawn into queen. Opponent king at d7. My queen at f7 check. Opponent king d6. My queen at f1. Opponent's king at d7. My king at f7. Opponent king at d6. My king at e1. Opponent's king c7. My queen d2. Opponent's king c6. My queen d1. Opponent's king c7. My queen d5. Opponent's king at c8. My king at e7. Opponent's king at c7. My queen at c4 check. Opponent's king at b6. My king at c6. Opponent's king at b7. My queen at c5. Opponent's king at b8. My king at c6. Opponent's king at c8. My king at d6 with check. Opponent's king at b8. My king at c6. Opponent king at c8. My queen at e7. Opponent's king at b8. And my queen at b7, checkmate. Thank you so much, guys. Goodbye until next time.